Well, poop. Because I just did a really good video and it didn't take. So I'm having to redo it and I'm thinking it's not going to be as good. So here we go, and this is take 2, and blah. That's how I feel, so I thought I'd share it with you. But I'm going to do my best to recreate it. So I hope you enjoyed doing your introductions and reading about your classmates and peers. It's really important to try to build a community in these online courses. It's hard when you don't have the face-to-face, aspect. But we're doing our best to try to get to know each other and work with this medium, which is super helpful on other levels, right? So even though you don't have the face-to-face component, you have the convenience of being able to do it when you can, and all of the great perks that come with online classes. So anyway, I hope that worked well for you. And now we're kind of turning a corner. So now we're starting to really get into some academic work, right? It's been kind of fun and games up to now, and now we're going to do some kind of deeper thinking. We're going to start talking about literacy, and I always think it's funny when I hear that word, oh, let's talk about literacy studies. It's just a fancy way of talking about or saying, what are your reading and writing practices? And how do they work? And so I always think it's interesting when I hear literacy practices, and I'm like, oh, they're just talking about reading and writing. So if you think that sounds fancy and difficult, don't worry about it, because it's not. So what we've done to try to think about these practices, we've put some materials together for you to read. So there's 3 materials. There's a article by Amy Tan, an article by Andrea Lunsford, and then there's a TED Talk from John McWhorter. Yes, watching something is also reading in an interesting way. Again, these materials we're hoping that they allow you to look at reading and writing in more complex ways, that it's just not as simple as people like to say it is. So a lot of times you'll hear older generations saying, like, oh, those young kids, they can't write anymore. They don't know how to write, or they don't read enough. And we know really that that's not true, and that will be addressed in Andrea Lunsford's piece, this idea that you actually are doing more reading and writing than any other generation before. And we want to think about literacy and reading and writing in way more complex terms than we're currently thinking about them. And that's why these materials are very different. So Amy Tan, that article that you're going to read, she's really interesting. I don't know if you ever read the book or watched the movie The Joy Luck Club, but she talks about language kind of from a second language learner perspective. So she talks about how she uses different Englishes, which I think is so interesting. And how she speaks to her mother is very different than how she speaks academically when she's talking about her work. So it's a really interesting article. My dad is actually, well, I'm Apache Indian too, but my dad's probably about 68% Apache Indian, but he actually spoke Spanish before English. So I used to ask my dad when he was a kid, what do you dream in, English or Spanish? I didn't ask him when he was a kid. I asked him when I was a kid. Dad, what do you dream in, English or Spanish? And he said this really interesting thing that has really stuck with me over the years. He said, it depends on what I'm dreaming. And I think that's so right, like when you think about how you use language. I mean, he says, I dream in the language that's most appropriate for the thing I'm dreaming about. And I know several people who speak multiple languages, and sometimes they'll do Spanglish, and and they'll say one word that's in Spanish and one in English, and it's because maybe there's not a word that really captures that idea in the other language, so they move back and forth. So Tam plays with this idea of language and how it's used, and I think you'll like that article. John McWhorter, if you like him, you can go onto YouTube, and he's got lots of other videos. This is a TED Talk, actually. And he talks about literacy and writing, per se, as writing as something that came out of actually speech. And that the real that communicating and speaking with one another was really the way that writing started. And then if we looked at writing in terms of when it happened within society, and we looked at it like a clock, that it would have been like the last couple minutes of, right before midnight when writing started. So he has a really interesting take about writing also. So your job is to read and look at these 3 pieces of material and really think about the complicated ways that we think about literacy. I hope you have been using your calendar. Here's my printed one. Yay! And you will note that, that there's 2 columns, right? The thing that it's assigned and then the due date. And so the due date for the readings is Wednesday, July 31st. Now you can't see that. And then you're supposed to respond on Blackboard, a response in your forum by Thursday, August 1st. So let me clarify a little bit about, there's a little blurb that says, write a short response to one of the readings or compare 2 or 3 of the text in your group discussion forum called respond to blah, 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 blah. So let me clarify what I'm looking for. I think this will help. You can focus on one text if it really stood out to you and you really want to spend some time there. You could compare a couple. Maybe, I don't know, but what comes to my mind is Lunsford and McWhorter, but I mean, it could be any 2 that you're really interested in. You could take a look at all 3. It's entirely up to you what you want to spend your time focusing on. All of those are appropriate responses. I'm thinking it should be 2 to 3 what I would consider chunky paragraphs. So, a chunky paragraph is probably 4 to 5 sentences, maybe more. It should have some meat to it. It should be solid. I'm not necessarily looking for citing, but you may want to. You may want to talk about something the text is saying. I'm not really looking for works cited pages, but that could be there. No, it wouldn't be there. Scrap that, because it wouldn't make sense. But I am looking for little things like attention to detail. So a lot of times I have students say crazy things like, but Google doesn't dot my I's. So not that you're using Google, and I mean, not dot your I's, capitalize your I's, and I'm like, yeah, but we do. So, so think about those things, like, remember that thing I said a couple videos ago? You should put your best effort forward, and so I'd like you to do that, right? And I'd like you to try to think of this a little bit like academic, so that would then encourage you to use certain types of forms. Does that make sense? But I'm not going to nitpick on it. I just want to see what your writing's like. What else can I tell you? I think that's it. So please go right ahead and respond to this. I'm so intrigued to hear what you have to think about this material. I'm hoping it allows you to think about it in different ways, or dispel some of the myths that we have about what's good or bad or writing. I don't like thinking in those terms. It's binary, good and bad. Writing doesn't work that way. It's a lot of times choices. It's thinking about how to communicate something in an effective manner, thinking about audience. I think that's part of the reasons why I talked about grammar, which I don't really like to talk about, is that, it's totally acceptable to not capitalize your I's when you're texting, because it would be kind of weird maybe for some people to do that otherwise. But maybe when there's something's academic, even a discussion post, if you're thinking about that idea of audience, maybe you're thinking, maybe I should, put that comma in, or think about how I want this to sound to the reader. Because I truly believe that's what grammar is about, is trying to convey the meaning in the clearest way possible to the reader. And that's your audience, right, is who's looking at the material that you're writing. I hope this helps. I'm looking forward to reading your stuff. Hoping that these are interesting materials and that it's starting your brain to think, and that it's allowing you to think differently and allowing you to know that that literacy is a very complex concept, and that and that we can think about it in different ways than possibly we have before. Okay, y'all, have a super day, and I'll talk to you later.